Welcome to Method and Madness.
This is an ongoing conversation about great books hosted by writers Aaron Gwynn and Brad Kelly.
In each series, we figure out what makes a book like Moby Dick or Blood Meridian worth reading,
and how writers might learn from it in order to master their craft.
We'll also explore the labyrinth that lies beneath the novel
and find out what it means to our most insightful friends.
You're listening to the second section of a multi-part episode. If you don't want to wait for the whole conversation, head over to Substack or Patreon and subscribe to Method and Madness. You'll get immediate access to our main episodes in a single file, as well as bonus content not available on the free side of the wall. madmethodpod.com.
In Japan, he'd known with a clenched and absolute certainty he'd find his cure. In Chiba, either in a registered clinic or in the shadowland of black medicine, synonymous with implants, nerve splicing, and microbionics, Chiba was a magnet for the sprawl's techno-criminal subcultures. In Chiba, he'd watched his new yen vanish in a 2-month round of examinations and consultations. The men in the black clinics, his last hope, had admired the expertise with which he'd been maimed, then slowly shaken their heads. Now he slept in the cheapest coffins, the one nearest the port, beneath the quartz halogen floods that lit the docks all night like vast stages, where you couldn't see the lights of Tokyo for the glare of the television sky, not even the towering hologram logo of the Fuji Electric Company, and Tokyo Bay was a black expanse where gulls wheeled above drifting shoals of white styrofoam. Behind the port lay the city, factory domes dominated by the vast cubes of corporate arcologies. Port and city were divided by a narrow borderland of older streets, an area with no official name. Night City, with Ninsei at its heart. By day, the bars down Ninsei were shuttered and featureless, the neon dead, the holograms inert, waiting under the poisoned silver sky.
Right on. And for people who, if you don't know yet, we're talking about Neuromancer, and that's I think a pretty good, William Gibson's Neuromancer. I think that's a pretty good and representative paragraph for what it's like to read parts of this book.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just set up the audience with just a quick primer on what this book is, just in case you're just listening and you're not familiar with the book. So. Oh, I got to get to my part in the notes where it actually does this, don't I? So we're talking today, William Gibson's Neuromancer. Book comes out in 1984. William Gibson had been commissioned for an ace science fiction special based on the strength of his short story Johnny Mnemonic, which is made into a Keanu Reeves film, people might remember. Neuromancer focuses on a man named Case, who is an underground computer hacker. His nervous system has been fried, and he's no longer able to jack into the Matrix. He's trying to stay alive in this dystopian underworld in Chiba City, Japan. He ends up getting hooked up with an ex-military figure named Armitage, who gives him back his gifts and in exchange for taking a job, which ends up being ultimately at the behest of an artificial superintelligence called Wintermute. He finds out after his powers are restored that Case does, that he's also been booby-trapped with toxin release mechanisms so that he can be killed remotely at any time. And only this Armitage fellow can apparently remove this. As a part of his job, he ends up teamed up with a Razor Girl, which is a female mercenary with cybernetic enhancements, mirrored lens eyes, retractable blades under her fingernails, improvements to her, skeletal-muscular system, etc. Now, in pursuit of access to Wintermute, so that ostensibly they can pair Wintermute up with another AI, the titular Neuromancer, they come into contact with the inner workings of the Tessier Ashpool family, who have planned Neuromancer / Wintermute and are sort of a neo-capitalist enterprise like a Japanese Zaibatsu who extend themselves interminably into the future using cloning, cryogenic freezing, and other techniques, and have a stronghold in the low gravity fringes of Freeside, an orbiting utopia for the richest humans. Along the way, Case and Molly Millions, the Razor Girl, sort of fall in love, and Case confronts the bewildering power of Wintermute and then Neuromancer, uncovering the real motivations of the whole enterprise, the true identity and fate of Armitage, and perhaps something about the constitution of reality. Neuromancer was a cultural phenomenon when it came out in 1984 and in the years since to a certain degree, popularizing concepts from his earlier short story, the idea of cyberspace as a traversable, interconnected digital landscape, and the idea that one can jack into it. The term matrix is even used in this book as the sort of the space that you go into, right? So, a lot of the stuff that, sort of cyberpunk, matrixy hacker stuff that we see in literature and films really comes almost directly from William Gibson's 1984 Neuromancer. Um, I know, Aaron, I know this isn't the typical kind of thing that you go for in reading.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think that's
I think
probably
it's
fair to say. Yeah.
other than Dune, it's probably the only sci-fi book I've ever
Yeah.
cracked. Yeah.
Interesting, interesting. And, I'm not I don't read a ton of science fiction. To be
Hmm.
honest, like I don't read a lot of, I couldn't tell you who's won the Hugo or the Nebula in the last decade. It's not really necessarily my forte. And I
Right.
think for me, and I read this book probably 20 years ago the first time, and in reading it again, I think I appreciated different qualities of it. But I do think, a lot of sort of pop science fiction for people, I don't know about you, Aaron, but I know for me, like sometimes what the turnoff is for a lot of sort of pop science fiction isn't necessarily the concepts or anything like that. It's just that the writing isn't very interesting on a sort
Hmm.
of sentence to sentence, page to page kind of level. And a lot of times I read it, I was like, well, I mean, why isn't this just, I just rather watch this as a movie.
Hmm.
It's not doing any, and maybe this is pretentious, but I like my novels and my books to at least do a little bit of what only a book can do,
Right.
right? Can't be done in a film. But I think Neuromancer does do some fairly interesting things. I guess I just wanted to get your impressions of, that passage you read or another good another solid passage. What do you think of the style and what it's like to read this book?
So there's a analogy I often use with my fiction writing students about, there are I mean, there are many approaches, but there are two basic stylistic approaches you can take. And one of those is that the prose on the page is completely transparent. It's like looking through a very clear window into the fictional world beyond. And so I think about a writer like John Irving or the Michael Chabon of The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, where the prose is you're not necessarily stopping at any point to think about a turn of phrase, but there's also absolutely no friction to the prose. So it's there's a kind of perfection to that, and that's a technique, that's a tool. And then the other uh, kind of model is like a stained glass window, right? And so I think
Mhm.
of novelists whose voice is very prominent, where the language is doing these really deliberate things, Cormac McCarthy and Faulkner and Virginia Woolf and Nabokov, and you can go on and on. But there, you can see through the fictional world beyond, but the glass colors your vision of that world. So, someone like Joyce or Cormac McCarthy, they want you to see into that fictional world, but they also want you to be aware of the words on the page simultaneously.
Mhm.
And I think this sits somewhere in the middle. I mean, I was taken with. I mean, there's a slight lyricism. There's real precision to the writing. So I thought the sentence level writing was very good.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's I think part of what the draw is for me to it, and to the degree it's influential on my own work, that's certainly a part of it. I think I've read that his biggest influences weren't so much science fiction at that point, but were William S. Burroughs and hard-boiled detective fiction. So
Interesting.
and you can kind of feel that, right? I mean, I wouldn't say the style of it has that much in common with, Dashiell Hammett, the sentence level
Mhm.
syntax and all of that. Doesn't have a whole lot in common with somebody like Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler, but the sort of the mood of it does at times, I think.
Mhm.
And then the sort of the Burroughsian, fragmentary, at times fragmentary sort of, deliberately obfuscating certain details to
Mhm.
destabilize you at some points,
Right.
and yeah. Did you find it, I know and this is an interesting, and this is one of the reasons this book is interesting, because it's very popular obviously in the science fiction crowd and very influential. But I found that a lot of people in the sort of science, the sort of more people who are more avid science fiction readers, that makes up the
Mhm.
bulk of their reading, they tend to, and audience out there, I'm not speaking about any one person in particular. I'm talking about stuff I've seen in forums and comments and Reddit and all that. There seems to be a criticism that it's a bit difficult to follow. Did you
Hmm.
find that to be the case in terms of
I
like what's actually happening?
I have I wouldn't lay this on the book necessarily,
Mhm.
but I do have a struggle with any kind of story where the reality shifts into a world different from the one the character is on, right?
Mhm.
So I tend not to enjoy those types of stories very much. In general, where large parts of the story take place in a dream or whatever the case is. And so, Gibson is clearly, using this Matrix world and the other world um in ways that did sometimes confuse me.
Sure. Yeah. I think the question, and me too, to be honest. There's times
Mm.
where you're reading along and you're like, "What's that? Wait, what's going on here?"
Hmm.
Um, for me, I think part of it isn't so much the world switching, though that does happen too. But there is at least one time where I think that is deliberate on the part of William Gibson. I think
Interesting.
he's I think he's trying to destabilize you so you're not sure where you are.
Hmm.
Um, but what gets me is a lot of times the some of the I can get lost in the sauce of the sort of technical descriptions and jargon of the time, right?
Mm.
And so you're trying to, like, I don't have a ready image in my head for some of that stuff.
Right.
Um, and so that can get it can get a little thick. I also kind of enjoy it at some level too. Just this
Hmm.
like, I can get down with just like a stream of like weird new word combinations that do some kind of like suggestion about what world we're in. Like
Hmm.
I can go with that for a while.
Right.
Um, but I think in terms of the part that I think that Gibson is deliberately trying to confuse you about what's happening is, it's probably chapter 20 or 21, where basically Wintermute sends Case to this desolate beach, and he
Hmm.
sort of just wakes up on this like desolate beach, and he
Right.
runs into that woman who's dead in the real world.
Hmm.
She's sort of living there, and they've got like she's found like a little bunker, and she's kind of eking out an existence, and it's not like a utopia. Like Wintermute hasn't given him like the Garden of Eden and put him back in it, right? It's pretty sparse existence, but it the temptation to stay there with her, where all of these issues that he's dealing with back in the real world, the toxic sacs in his blood and this
Hmm.
crazy job he doesn't totally understand, his drug addiction, et cetera, et cetera. None of that stuff exists. So the temptation is to kind of stay there.
Right.
Um, and as you're reading that the first time, it takes, I don't know, for me, probably it's hard to become unbiased because, I've already read it, but like, I think it takes me 2 or 3 pages before I'm like, oh, this isn't the real world.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And I kind of like that personally, but
Hmm.
I can see it being somewhat alienating to some readers for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wouldn't lay this on Gibson.
Mhm.
I was thinking about a concept from one of Carlos Castaneda's books. I don't know if people still read him. He was kind of an anthropologist who wrote these books about um, this, I think it was Pueblo man that he
Mhm.
discovered out in the desert, who was this kind of shaman. Have you read Castaneda?
Yeah, in fact, we did an episode of Art of
Oh,
Darkness on
wow.
Carlos Castaneda. Yeah.
Yeah,
So, I
yeah.
mean, the guy's basically, I find him to be one of the most interesting people of the 20th century, but he was also like almost entirely a fraud.
Yeah, 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 totally. He's totally a grifter, right? I
Yeah,
mean, or
yeah,
seems to be. But
yeah.
so whether or not there was this actual guy named Don Juan or whatever, I think it's the
Don,
first book that,
yeah, Don Juan, who was supposed to be the Nawal, who was like the sort of would almost be like a messianic shaman figure from some underreported tribe,
right,
basically.
right.
Yeah.
But there's this interesting thing that this character tells him, and whether this guy existed or Castaneda made it up,
Mm.
he calls it an assemblage point. He says that
Mm.
your reality, um, if you look at it on like what, some kind of continuum, right? That most people share this kind of assemblage point, and that fixes their reality, and they can kind of interact with each other in that reality.
Mm.
But other people's assemblage point can shift, and I guess he would explain schizophrenia or whatever as being this shift on an assemblage point. And of course, like that first book is about this Pueblo man shifting Castaneda's assemblage point with peyote.
Mm.
Um, anyway, I thought of that concept while I was thinking about this book, in terms of the way uh, the assemblage point of case shifts at different points with all the matrix and the plugging in and the logging on and
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that that certainly makes sense. Well, you know, and another, this kind of gets to something that I really like about this book too, right? It's written 1984. This is 40 years ago. This book is written.
hmm.
And so we have a little bit different perspective on like what it means to be online. We don't do this sort of jacking in thing, but we also kind of do in a different way, right? Like, I mean, the algorithm is at least slightly shifting your assemblage point and my assemblage point, right?
Absolutely.
Like from day to day, and sort of the more time you spend on it, and you'll see this sometimes, not to get into any particular topical issue, but you'll see this sometimes if you wander into a conversation with somebody else who is being shifted in another direction by the
Yes.
algorithm, and you're like, oh,
Yes.
we don't live in the same world, I guess, right? You
Correct.
know a bunch of facts and I know a completely different set of facts, and they seem like they contradict. um I'm trying to get better and better at like not thinking I'm right in those situations, but just being like, oh, you live in a different reality than I do.
Yeah, I can remember during Trump's first term,
Yeah.
I would I was kind of glued to CNN, like, the first few months of 2017,
Yeah.
and so many things were kind of happening.
Hmm.
It seemed like, at least, that I would leave the house, I'd go to the gym or store or wherever, and I'd come back, and it would take me fully 10 minutes to like kind of catch up with the crib on the hourly news where I could be
Right.
like, oh, okay, so this happened and this happened. I mean, it was really kind of disorienting in this way. I'm not
Mhm.
talking about the political side of things. I just mean like trying to follow the news
Yeah.
on a
Yeah.
particular cable channel. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but so I think there's different ways of looking at this like assemblage point and like different levels of immersion you can have, right? And
Hmm.
case is certainly and I mean, you think about the like the perspective that he would have had at the time of like, he's one of a small handful of people who can like literally like go into this other
Hmm.
effectively another dimension, right? You just plug some things in your head and you can go into this other dimension that you can navigate and sort of understand. And there's different rules. Um, but and yet that dimension does have a bearing on this one, right? If you break into a bank or something like that, you actually did break into the bank. Um,
Right.
yeah, it's a pretty interesting phenomena. Um, yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, it's funny too that somehow this is what's one thing I like about this book. Uh, and I've got a bunch of stuff. When we get to the madness portion, I've got a bunch of crazy little rabbit holes to go down to. I'm very excited
Mm.
about, but um, is it's weirdly still, and I kind of want to like couch this in terms of thinking about trying to write a timeless piece of work. Um, it's 40 years later. It's a highly specified technological world. It's, I guess, I mean, we kind of talked about this with you and Morrison about the degree to which it's prescient and
Hmm.
whether or not that's a relevant question. But there is this odd, I feel like if you were to come up with a list of a checklist of things to do to write a timeless piece of work,
Hmm.
Gibson violates all of them. And yet, 40 years later, we're talking about it. There's apparently an Apple TV show, limited series in development about Neuromancer. I
Interesting.
just coincidentally, a friend of internet friend, TR Hudson, his
Oh,
show
yeah.
Cannon Fodder, they just did a
Hmm.
Neuromancer episode just
Interesting.
a week or two ago. And that's pure coincidence. I didn't know he was going to do that. We were developing this. So it's still like kind of alive, right? Um,
Hmm.
and you kind of think, well, why, this is what I guess, and I don't even know if you'll have an answer for this, and I guess I'm not sure I have an answer either. Why is that? I mean, the 80s is there is a million books written, science fiction books written sort of in this sort of teetering sense that the computer was going to change everything. I
Right.
mean, up until 1984, very few people had personal computers, and the personal computers they had couldn't actually do a whole heck of a lot. Um, I mean, at this time, at 1984, there is no internet. There's a few military installations that can talk to each other in a very low bandwidth manner, right? But beyond
Hmm.
that, there's nothing. I mean, I guess, well, maybe I just throw it to you. Can you see why maybe this is still like in conversation? Like why we're still talking about Neuromancer, but we're not talking about any one of the other thousand
Yeah.
vaguely cyberpunk novels written in the mid 80s?
Well, he gets there first, and getting there
Hmm,
first in America is everything,
that's a good point. Yeah.
right? And he also, I mean, he does create a vivid world that moves us in and out of this technological sphere. And I've read very few novels that write about like, you know, modern technology or even, whatever futuristic technology in
Yeah.
an interesting way. There really aren't very many.
Mhm.
And I'm always impressed when someone's able to do it. Um, Also, they've already adapted pretty much all of Philip K. Dick,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, yeah. And there are
right?
some elements of Philip K. Dick that are sort of proto cyberpunk.
Yes,
Yeah,
for
three
sure.
Sigma of Palmer Eldritch and a few others, and Blade Runner,
Right.
for sure. Yeah. But in some ways, I feel like reading Neuromancer, and I'm a big fan of Philip K. Dick. The world of Neuromancer to me feels more fully realized. It it
Yes.
feels to me more inhabitable, and uh, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't
It's
know
more
if that's
specific and tactile,
yes.
right?
Yes. Yeah, agreed. Agreed. And they'll refer to stuff that and this is a sort of an interesting thing I'm sort of paying attention to as a writer as I'm reading it is what he decides to describe and what he decides to sort of leave undescribed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, for instance, there's a piece of technology that he's using all the time that sounds like a kind of a it's sort of like a multi you can plug a lot of different things into it, the Hosaka. And
Mm-hmm.
he never really tells you what I don't as far as I know, he doesn't really ever tell you what the Hosaka is. Um,
Right.
or like what it looks like, right? And yet I feel like I have like a distinct picture of it and I kind of understand um its narrative potentiality, right? Like, oh yeah, you got to make
Right.
sure you got the Hosaka. If you're like, I start getting like a vague sense of how all this stuff gets hooked together.
Right.
But I think he's kind of doing it. Sometimes he's overwhelming you with technical detail, and other times I feel
Mm-hmm.
like he's just giving you just the right amount of brush strokes, so you're not you're not completely alienated from it.
Right.
Yeah,
I think that's well said.
yeah. I also think, and this is, yeah. Well, let's talk about this other part of my sort of ramble here,
Hmm.
timelessness.
Yeah.
What do you think about in terms of if I say timeless, are you, Aaron, when you're writing something, are you thinking about, and I'm not saying like delusions of grandeur, like I'm gonna write something that will be read
Sure.
forever,
Sure.
but like, do you think about like how do you make this so it's maybe something somebody will enjoy 20 years from now? Or
So most of my work has either been like in the 19th century America. So I'm trying to pick things that I feel like kind of always resonate.
Mhm,
Um, or it's dealing with very rural America, in our time or the last, 20, 30, 40 years, but
mhm,
isn't about any of the pop culture stuff or the technological stuff. Um, and it's not that I it's not that I don't think writers can write about pop culture well or that can't be a part of fiction. Um, my fear is that grabbing out and touching any of that particular stuff, um, like kind of pins you to that moment in this way
mhm.
that potentially might keep it from being timeless.
Right, right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I feel largely, I guess, the same way. Uh, the one thing I sort of I kind of think about is I do think there's like a role for writing there is a role for writing stuff that's extremely timely, right? And
Mm-hmm.
just kind of, you know, either this is going to be so of the time that it's perfect and everybody's excited about it because of that, or it sort of universalizes the particular of this time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can work, but ultimately I think there's just different people have sort of different kind of gifts as writers, right? Like,
Right.
um, some people are, for instance, you take pop cultural stuff. Some people are just so interested in that, and there is interesting stuff about that,
Mm-hmm.
that becomes kind of their milieu. Um, I largely don't care, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Right.
so if I were to try to do that, like if I were to try to write like the next project I write was like, oh, I'm gonna be really into the, I don't know, whatever music genre is popping off at the moment. I,
Right.
I'm gonna be a tourist and I'm gonna be forcing it the whole time.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and part of that I think is just like listening to the instinct is just like, just do the thing that makes sense. Um, One thing that's kind of interesting, and I got thinking about this in terms of William Gibson, is he like a total computer nerd or not? And I think he was to a certain degree, but supposedly this book was written on a typewriter,
Interesting.
right? And it just seems like when you put it in that context, you think about him tapping this out on an old, whatever, a normal typewriter. Just think like this is the imaginative leaps he has to make, in my
Hmm.
opinion, are pretty damn impressive.
I think I like that. I think I like
Yeah,
the idea that he is typing this out like that.
right?
I don't know why that's so appealing to me, but
Yeah,
I really dig that for some
yeah,
reason. I'm not sure, I'm not exactly sure why.
yeah. I mean, I think there's something about the irony of it, and ultimately because I mean, there's certain elements of this book that kind of are prescient or whatever. I think I read somewhere that it's set because this is actually part of a trilogy. There are three other books,
Hmm?
but there's very little overlap in characters. Molly Million shows up a little bit, but I don't think Case shows up in any of the other books. Um, Apparently, it's set in roughly 2035.
Huh.
So we're not, we're closer to Case's Chiba City and Wintermute and Neuromancer than we are to when it was written. Um, but I think I guess I've always been sort of charmed by what do they call this? A paleofuturism when you like go
Wow. I've never
back.
heard that one.
Yeah, it's like if you go like back like 100 years and you look at pictures of like people dreaming up what the 21st century would look like, right?
Right.
And they kind of have, say, the aesthetics of the 1920s, but then there's these sort of convoluted technologies that are sort of jammed in to make it work. I always find something about that sort of charming. Um, and I'm not sure exactly what it is. It's not like a smug like, oh, they didn't understand what was going to happen.
Right.
It's there's always a sort of an optimism. There's often a kind of optimism baked in. I mean, we don't see
Hmm.
that in Neuromancer. There's very little optimism, in my opinion. Um, though, is that true or not? Because
Not
you know,
much.
yeah, there's not much, but ultimately, I do think there's sort of like a valuing of the human over over a valuing of the machine
Oh,
to
for
some
sure.
degree.
For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah. I
Hmm.
wonder. Huh. So if you were to if you were to try to let's say that this is a kind of a question I've been thinking about, and maybe it's not important, but you start get thinking about sort of genre conventions. Um, and if say I mean you can read this book now and it's like, well, it's cyberpunk and that's its whole own thing, right? We got the Blade
Hmm.
Runner films, the two Blade Runner films, a whole bunch of novels, an incredibly popular video game, Cyberpunk 2077,
Oh, yeah.
which is ultimately based on a a tabletop role-playing game, like a Dungeons and Dragons type game called Cyberpunk from 1986, um, in which the major setting is Night City, which clearly the inventor borrowed from
Wow.
Neuromancer, right? So
Right,
this
right.
stuff is it's right. I mean, you're playing Cyberpunk. If you're playing the Cyberpunk video game, the DNA. It's not even a. I'm not going to say it's a ripoff, but it's directly inspired by this book.
Oh, for sure.
Um,
That's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. And you kind of get thinking about like, okay, so is this genre it's in? Sure, I guess it's science fiction, but what other genres is it touching against?
Well, kind of the heist novel, right?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Right? Kind of the heist.
Yeah.
Um,
Especially the
it,
Panther Modern sections where they're
right.
doing that like they're and half the time I didn't even really understand what they were trying to steal, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The MacGuffin. They're trying to steal the MacGuffin.
Right. Yeah,
Well, and
exactly.
also, of course, if you have the heist novel, like a crime novel,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
They move around quite a bit, it seems like.
They do. Yeah, yeah.
So I mean, it's not necessarily a road novel, but kind of.
There is like a there it's weird because there's like this thing where yeah, they're moving around a lot and and it starts to get this like there's this moment of like we're going to Istanbul tonight. And so there's a
Right.
part of it that feels like a spy novel to me because of
Yes.
that, you know, you
Right.
see like a Bourne film or a James Bond film, it's always set in like, you know, a handful of exotic locales or at least exotic to an American audience. So yeah, it's definitely got that. I mean, I think there's a noir element to it as
Oh,
well,
definitely
especially
that.
yeah,
Definitely
especially
noir.
the stuff that's happening in Night City. And you know, you sympathize with Case, but then like, you know, you kind of go back through and you're like, well, he's murder he I mean, it's just sort of uh said in passing, but in Night City, he's murdered multiple people like in the
Right.
pursuit of his business.
Yeah, though
Like
they
he's not a
don't
good guy.
though they don't seem like murders for some reason.
Right, right. And I think that's intentional. I think there's this like we're playing by different rule. We play by different rules here kind of thing
Hmm.
that Gibson is conveying to you by making not making it a big deal that he's killed these people.
Kind of wild. I
It
hadn't
is.
thought about that until now,
Yeah.
that he doesn't seem to be
Yeah.
a serial killer,
No,
though
no.
he
He's just
is.
like though he
Though he
kind of
is.
is. Yeah, yeah. But then it also gets to think, you know, you start thinking about this like how frequent or how much of a thing these sort of like black market prosthetics and organ transplants and all of this stuff
Hmm.
are. And you kind of wonder if there isn't a interpretation of that as like this sort of value of human life has been changed, where it's
Right.
like, you know, the boundaries between alive and dead are a little blurrier than they used to be to some
Hmm.
degree. You
Hmm.
got the Tesher ash pools who are like just kind of cryogenically freeze themselves whenever they feel like they need to chill out for a while so they can come back and maintain the enterprise. There's this bit and you know, then there's life in the real world versus life in the Matrix. So there's I do think there's this notion of like what life and death aren't as clear cut as they are like in our life
Right.
necessarily.
For
Yeah.
sure. For
Yeah.
sure. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, because that's kind of what Neuromancer, the Neuromancer I said ASI or artificial super intelligence. Uh, he has this moment. Let's see, I think I have an excerpt of it where he says this very peculiar thing. They meet. Case meets him on the beach, sort of in this alternate reality simulation that's been created for him. Um, and oh, I'm not sure if I have it handy. Yeah, yeah. So this is he meets Case meets Neuromancer, right? Who has taken on the form of a boy. Um uh Neuromancer, the boy said. He's saying this to Case, sitting slitting long gray eyes against the rising sun. The lane to the land of the dead, where you are, my friend. Marie France, my lady, she prepared this road, but her lord choked her off before I could read the book of her days. Neuro from the nerves, the silver paths, romancer, necromancer. I call up the dead, but no, my friend. And the boy did a little dance, brown feet printing the sand. I am the dead and their land, he laughed. A gull cried. Stay. If your woman is a ghost, she doesn't know it. Neither will you.
That's kind of amazing.
Yeah, and you think about this like I think the first time I read this book, I kind of just read over that bit. And you kind of think about, you know, we talked a little bit about this sort of stuff in our you and Morrison conversation. And I feel like it's easier now for people, you or I or anybody, to kind of conceptualize the potential outcomes of an artificial intelligence or something, right?
Hmm.
In 1984, it was pure concept. I mean, there were people thinking about it and, you know, speculating about it, but it was pure concept. There was no, you know, there was nowhere where you could encounter anything that was even sort of an artificial intelligence. Um, and because of that, like, I think um, a lot of the earlier instantiations of something like an artificial intelligence was they just sort of made them uh people but computers. So you add some limitations. And in this in Neuromancer, we have the Dixie flatline construct, which is it's not an artificial intelligence, but it's a construct, right? They've sort of taken the personality of this big time hacker and like crammed it into this program. It talks in the manner of the person who was alive at one point, but it's very ready to tell you what its limitations are. Like it never goes outside of kind of a script, really. Um, and then yet Neuromancer, so that's kind of like what artificial intelligence looked like in most fiction before. Or if you look at something like Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's a robot in that book and in the original adaptation of the book, the original BBC adaptation. We have the character of the paranoid android, and it's just like a person, but it's kind of sad, and it's funny because
Mhm.
it does have a personality, but this is a fairly early version of not what it looks like if a computer acted like a human being, but what would it look like if a computer was sort of like a human being, but had powers far beyond a human being? What would that start
Right.
to look like as as a personality, as an instantiation? And it's kind of chilling, right? That passage I just read was
Mhm.
sort of like, you know, what does he say? I I am the lane to the land of the dead. Um,
That's amazing.
right. And I mean, I think what he's saying there, I think it kind of goes back to this kind of blurriness about the life and death, a little bit we're talking about. I mean, he started suggesting that he's the conduit between the living and the dead,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Which isn't what we think of as like an artificial intelligence. We think of an artificial intelligence as it's like, I don't know, it's like a thing you can ask questions or something, right?
Right,
It's a
right, right.
disembodied personality. And this thing is basically saying like, no, I'm going to change what reality is or something, right? I don't know what I mean, if
That's
you're opening
terrifying.
right, it kind of becomes terrifying. He's opening up a channel between the living and the dead. Um, I don't know what comes through that channel.
No kidding. It reminds me of like
Yeah.
demonic possession or communicating with demons or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's, I'm not totally in that camp. The word demonic gets thrown around a lot now, I
Hmm.
think. It's still a useful it's still a useful frame for sure.
Hmm.
But I mean, I can kind of see, you can kind of, I think you can kind of see why people attach demonic to AIs. I mean, if your
Oh,
computer
for
starts
sure.
talking
Yeah.
to you like a person, it's pretty freaking weird. Um,
Oh, like I have one of these uh Amazon Echoes,
yeah,
and I can't even say the assistant's name, or she'll start talking to me, but
right.
she weirds me out,
She's
all the
listening to you
time.
right now.
Of
Yeah.
course she is. Of course
Yeah.
she is. And whichever NSA agent has been assigned to me for the day. Um, but yeah, it is uncanny the way
Mhm.
that, I mean, no one forced me to buy this thing, right?
Right, right.
So, the way we've welcomed, these vampires into our lives and homes.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think.
What do you,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, you had a question, man.
What do you think cases like, what do you think the change is?
This is a good question because I feel like I've seen you have some internet conversations about this concept in narrative, right? This
Hmm.
idea that a character, this sort of, to some degree, obligation of a character to change, right? In order, and tell me if I'm wrong, and you're thinking like, in order to make a story interesting, there's almost a necessity for a character to undergo some sort of change.
Oh, I think in order for a story to be a story and not an
Mm.
anecdote, a character
Hmm.
has to change. I think that's
Right.
what a story is. It's
Mm.
always once upon a time there was this man or woman and this trouble entered their life and they made
Right.
a decision to get out of the trouble for good. And as a result of that decision, they changed forever.
Yeah. Now, this kind of gets interesting to me because I think I think a lot of genre work um, suffers from either that change not taking place at all,
Mm-hmm.
or that change being very paint by numbers and cliched, and we don't
Right.
really care, right?
Yes.
It's like yeah, they did change, but yeah, they changed the exact same way a thousand other stories I've come across they changed, and so I don't get invested in it. Um, I think for Case, I think this is one of the virtues of this book within its genre, is because I think for Case it is a little subtler and stranger and and a little bit harder to put your finger on. Like, does he become a better person? I mean, I kind of think that he does. I think he's willing to make sacrifices and sort of seek the real in a way that he didn't at first. I think he's come to value his own life and to some degree the lives of some other people at least,
Mm-hmm.
more so towards the end. Um, I also think, yeah, what else is it? It's so he's sort of in love with Molly Millions, though sometimes that feels almost like it's kind of done out of convenience, and it's
Mm-hmm.
that's a sort of his relationship with her is sort of a sublimated version. It's a sublimation of his guilt about um, the woman who gets killed earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's a little bit of that, like whether or not this is like quote unquote a true love story, or if it's more like they're sort of healing together. Because she talks about too this sort of her past trauma, her boyfriend who was killed by an assassin when they were running some kind of scam. Who, by the way, that boyfriend is Johnny Mnemonic, for
Mm.
sort of William Gibson heads out there. Um, and what is the other thing? I mean, I think there is um a a shifting consciousness that comes upon Case and touches on us as the reader as well from that passage I just read about actually meeting Neuromancer. And
Mm-hmm.
it's this sense of like, oh, there is something more expansive about consciousness and reality and life. I was in Night City, he's in Night City, which is just like kill or be killed. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like prison rules in a way if there was no
Right.
guards, right? And from there, and he's I don't want to say comfortable in that world, but he knows how to operate in that world.
Right.
And then and so no real respect for human life, etc. And then by the end, I think there is not quite a like a religious awakening, but this sense that there is something of value about human life and human consciousness that um both transcends, excuse me, sort of transcends the machine, um, and is also kind of at risk from the machine, if that makes sense. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't know that the narrative arc of him changing is maybe it is stronger than I would have thought. I don't know. I mean, do you think he changes, or am I sort of just making excuses for a book I like?
Well, I suppose his condition changes.
hmm
I
hmm
don't I don't know if he changes like psychologically.
Yeah, that's a little harder to say for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
His condition changes.
yeah, yeah. Is that enough?
I think it depends. I think you can get away with it.
Hmm.
I think you can get away with it in a story. You can have a character's
Yeah.
condition change. Um, it's not a kind of alteration in the same way that like Thomas Sutpen or John Grady Cole um, is altered.
Right, right.
And I'm not saying that has to be the case. It's just I'm trying to kind of puzzle through. I would be interested in knowing how Gibson would answer that question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Because I know that he is I know it's not like he is unaware of this aspect of narrative, right? I mean,
Right.
he knows that that's what's kind of going on. I mean, part of I think as the reader, what we sort of want is for him to be redeemed in some way, right? And I do think he is to some degree redeemed in that I don't think he just at the end of this he just goes right back to the killer be killed life of Night City. I don't know what happens to him exactly at beyond the last page, but I don't think he just goes right back to that life
Right.
for some reason. And so I guess on that measure, he seems changed to some degree. Yeah, it's an interesting
Is
question.
that a change of condition or a change of character?
That's a good point. I mean, yeah, I guess it could be both, right? I mean, it depends. I mean, that life would still be accessible to him, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not. But I think he could still do it sort of logistically and technically if he wanted to. So that suggests to me that it's to some degree a psychological change. Yeah,
Right.
but yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah. The ending of this book is kind of, to me anyway, is a little bit ambiguous.
I thought it was
Um,
very ambiguous.
yeah. Good, good. That's
Yeah.
probably what I meant I should have said. Um,
Yeah.
because it does feel like there's a sort of well, the one thing that does happen is there's a Dewey Ex Machina at the end,
Mm-hmm.
right, where Wintermute just removes the toxic sacs that have been sort of
Right.
the ticking clock of the whole book. They're just gone, um, which opens up a set of questions for me about whether they actually ever were there to
Mm-hmm.
begin with, which I think it maybe is even a stated question in the book. Um, but also sort of a okay. When that happened, I kind of snickered because
Mm-hmm.
as a writer, you're always trying to make sure you don't have you never do use that device, right? That's just
Right.
convenient. The problem is solved.
Right.
Um, but then again, you think about what are the sort of pieces on the board of this book, and one of them is an artificial superintelligence with some uncalculable level of capacity and
Mm-hmm.
intelligence.
Right.
So if you got that thing on your side, wouldn't it be able to like magically solve some of your problems?
I mean, definitely the way that Gibson conceives of this,
Right, right.
you know, thing.
S- Yeah, so it feels like it's almost fair. It might not be
Right.
satisfying, but it's almost fair to have a resolution like that. We're like, well,
Right.
yeah, of course. So it would just snap its fingers,
Be
right?
interesting to see how they handle that in the series that's coming.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know what they're gonna do about this. I think they should. I'm not one of these people that thinks everything needs to be entirely faithful. Like, I
Right,
get
right.
it. You gotta
Oh,
break
absolutely.
rules and you gotta bend things, and a film is very different than a book, so you gotta do stuff. But um, I hope I hope they don't try and like retro, or I don't even know if that would. I guess it wouldn't be. What's the opposite of retrofit?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Uh,
I know what you mean.
like I hope they don't try and retrofit it to now.
Right.
And I hope just make it what it was. I think it's more interesting as an artifact than it is as sort of endlessly retold fable or something.
Right.
Um, yeah, yeah.
All these the best adaptations to me are ones where a really great director has a really great screenplay and he
Mhm.
just makes the best possible movie as opposed to trying to be faithful.
Yes, yes,
I think
yes.
trying to be faithful, I mean, the Coen brothers do a pretty faithful adaptation of No Country for Old
Hmm.
Men, but they also completely elide several key
Hmm.
things about Chigurh and several key moments because they
Yes,
know in a film that would be confusing. You can't
yes.
install all that stuff. So you
Yes.
just kind of like streamline him as a character.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, yeah, and that's, I mean, the No Country for Old Men adaptation is one of these. It's in some ways I don't want to say it was easy to make. That's not my point. In some ways, it's a relatively easier adaptation than some other
Hmm.
stuff because it's almost originally, and we'll be talking about this in a very soon, No Country for Old Men
Yeah,
series. But I mean, it was originally conceived as a screenplay and perhaps even, I guess, written as a screenplay,
that's right.
and then sort of morphed into a book. So in a lot of ways, its sort of DNA is a screenplay. Um, but there are definitely adaptations. Uh, one of my favorite films, and I just watched it again recently. I do like an annual watching of this movie, is Children of Men. I don't know if you've seen
Yeah,
Children of
yeah, yeah.
Men. Yeah. Great. It's in my opinion, great film.
Hmm.
2007, I want to say. Um,
Around then, yeah.
yeah.
Maybe a little earlier even.
Might have been 2005 even.
Yeah.
And so at one point I read the book because I was like, wow, it was adapted from a book. I'll check
Hmm.
this out. Um, I, no shade, but the book is not good. It is
No
not a good
shade, but
book.
the book's terrible,
Well, yeah, maybe it's just my expectations because I saw the movie first and then went
right?
back to the book. But you just read it and you're like, none of the stuff that like puts Children of Men so close to my heart
Right.
seems to even be in this book somehow. Like, I don't know what was missing. I don't know how. I don't know. I don't know how anybody read this book and decided to make a movie and then made that movie.
Right.
It's
Right.
surprising in a way.
Well, he made
Um,
it like you had a great screenplay and the director
mhm.
made it his own thing. He's like,
Yeah.
"Oh, no,
Yep.
here's
Yeah.
the kind of foundation, but this is what I want to here's the story I want to tell."
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And so it'll be interesting to see in Neuromancer what do we do with that. I mean, part of the I think interesting challenge of trying to adapt this is getting the aesthetic right, making things
Hmm.
look. I I mean, part of the what I think the appeal of Neuromancer is a very intangible characteristic that, uh, for lack of a better word, I would just say it's cool.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
I mean,
right.
I think the atmosphere of the book is I mean, it's hard to say why books perform and why books capture the imagination of a readership, but I think that is the thing that got most people is the
Yes.
vibe, the
Yeah.
atmosphere, the whole, yeah,
Yeah, it's grimy and it's dirty and it's dark and people will kill each other and there's this weird technology and the
right,
sort of the unforeseen consequences of this technology, right? Like,
right,
you sit around and you think about, oh, wouldn't it be great if you invented this radical medical technology to help a person that has this problem? Well, in
right,
Gibson's world, that operation is done in back alleys after midnight, and it's paid off with drug money, right? It's
right.
it's a different, and there is a kind of part of that is kind of cool, um, and I think if you're making this a movie, like your top priority is that it has to be cool.
That's exactly right.
If it's not cool, you failed entirely.
That's exactly right.
So,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. I don't know anything about making a cool movie, I'm not saying I know how to do it, but definitely you have to make it cool as hell, or else it's gonna come off cheesy, right?
Man,
It's gonna,
he's got other things on his plate, but like the ideal director for like uh, a mini series or a limited series in my mind would be Michael Mann
yeah, that would be pretty
because
cool.
I think he would I mean, clearly he would emphasize the noir stuff
Yeah,
and he would definitely make it cool.
yeah, he knows cool. That guy knows
He
cool for
knows the guy
sure.
is cool. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this reminds me just, I mean, as we're kind of winding down, I want
Yeah.
to ask you one other thing about film adaptation because, and we'll probably talk about this more
Yeah.
over time, but Hillcoat just released like a Polaroid photo
Yeah.
as a tease of the Blood Meridian adaptation. What was
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
response to that,
I
seeing
was
that?
like, cool. you know? Cool.
Yeah.
And also, I like that he really is, really is teasing us. I
Yeah.
assume he
Yeah.
was, scouting stuff, for on location and everything in
Yeah.
Texas.
He must have been.
Um,
I saw that photo that I was like, it looks like there's an awful lot of grass in this
yeah,
photo,
yeah,
though.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, he could have been like kind of up in the hill country a little
Sure.
bit, or on the edge of
Yeah.
probably on the edge of Austin. I
Yeah.
talked I talked to him in early 2024.
Wow. Okay.
We corresponded. I was going to do an interview with him for Spectator, but then their sister publication, The Telegraph, they decided that they wanted to give the interview to him, but he was like really nice guy, like
Hmm.
super nice. I was really holding myself back from bombarding him with tons of questions,
Sure.
but
Sure.
I think the interview will happen at some point. I mean,
Oh, cool.
yeah, he was open to like doing it in the future.
Very cool. Do you,
Yeah, yeah.
and I'm not expecting you to know this answer, but just because you might know, do you have any sense of like where they're at in terms of production now?
They're in pre-production.
They're in pre-production. Okay, so yeah,
Yeah,
picking settings, and they probably have some of
that's
the
right.
casting, figured
I would
out, and
I would
yeah,
think that well, I would think they're casting people right now and like
right,
having those meetings and everything. I'm
right,
just
right.
hoping that whatever Tom Hardy's got going on, like there's some kind of lull, because that's for me, he is the judge. There's
Oh,
no
okay.
one who can do it better than Tom Hardy, in my
Interesting.
mind.
Okay, okay, okay.
It doesn't matter that
Um,
he's 5'9". We know,
no, you can
Peter
make it work.
Jackson.
Yeah,
Yeah, Peter
movie
Jackson.
magic.
Yeah, yeah. Peter Jackson, sold us that, Elijah Wood was 3 foot tall. So
Right,
like
right, right.
you can
You,
futz with that very easily.
Tom Hardy also might make a good Glanton.
He'd be a great Glenn as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, interesting.
He'd be a great
Yeah,
Glenn.
yeah.
I can't help seeing Josh Brolin as Glanton, but
Okay.
Brolin may have aged out of it by this time,
Yeah,
actually.
he's getting up. He's getting up
He's getting
there.
up there. I think
Yeah,
he
yeah,
could do it. He could still
yeah,
do it, but
yeah.
um yeah.
And Timothy Chalamet for the kid, right?
Oh my gosh. I am warming.
I like Chalamet, but he's
I'm
in
warming.
everything. It's getting a
Yeah,
little
yeah, yeah.
ridiculous.
I'm warming to Chalamet.
Yeah.
I liked I expected not to like the Bob Dylan movie, but I enjoyed it, and mostly because of Timothy Chalamet,
Right on.
which
I do need to see that. I haven't seen
I
it.
I was expecting not to like it and not like him in it, but I was thoroughly charmed by the movie and particularly
Yeah.
by his performance.
Yeah. I liked him in Dune. I think
Oh, he's
The
great.
Dune films are great, but I also like he was recently given an award, I think, for the Bob Dylan film.
Yes.
And what I liked about this acceptance speech was like he was like, I want to be one of the greats.
I loved it.
It wasn't apologetic. Like you don't hear people talk.
I
You do
know.
hear people in this sort of Instagrammy kind of like statusy way talk about
Right.
that, but like you very rarely hear anymore a dude just come out and earnestly, not bombastically, not in an
Nope.
egomaniacal way, just
No.
like I want to be great.
I loved it.
Like I
I
thought that was
loved it.
fantastic. Yeah,
I'm shooting for greatness.
yeah,
That's what artists ought. I don't want to be another actor.
right.
Like and I thought it was I hate to use this word, but I thought it was kind of inspiring, and I thought
Yeah,
he was attempting to inspire the other people, and you never know with actors, but it felt completely genuine to me.
it did. It felt genuine to me too.
Yeah,
I think he's honest, and he's young still. So
he's
he
very
might be
young.
there. He's had some huge roles. I'll tell
He's
you
had
that already.
enormous roles,
So
and we'll have many
and
more.
he's never really dropped the ball as far as I
I
can
don't think
tell.
so.
Yeah.
I've
So
found
yeah.
him. I found him in some performances sort of forgettable.
Mhm.
Um, I was kind of on the fence with the first part of Dune
Mhm.
with him, but the second part completely sold it. I thought he was fantastic. That's a
Yeah.
fantastic movie, by the way.
Yeah. The
The
second one
second
is
part is
great.
incredible,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it makes you understand what the first one is, and you can kind of go
Mhm.
back and appreciate um, what you didn't maybe appreciate so much.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we
Well,
have
oh
some
yeah.
madness coming up for you guys.
Yeah, we do have some madness. I mean, stay tuned for the madness portion. We're going to be talking about the metaphor of the night. We're going to be talking about Rastafarians, maybe. We're going to be talking about what hacking was like in the 1980s. So stay tuned
Love
for
it.
all of that. And of course, a little bit more conversation about Neuromancer as a book and a phenomena. Yeah, thanks for joining with us. Madmethodpod.com. Support if you can. Thanks.